Summer 1943 had settled over the Mariana Islands like a heavy, humid blanket, the kind that made every breath taste of salt and earth. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in jagged shards, illuminating the forest floor with a jittery, nervous light. Captain Robert Sterling wiped sweat from his brow, eyes narrowing at the yawning mouth of a cave half hidden by overgrown ferns. From a distance, it might have seemed innocuous, just another shadowed gap in the cliffside. Up close, it was a gaping maw of fear, a place where 1,200 civilians had been hiding for months, believing themselves invisible even to death. Sterling's second-in-command, Sergeant Frank Malone, crouched behind a fallen log, muttering under his breath as he examined the surrounding jungle. "If ghosts lived in sweat and mold, I'd say this is their penthouse," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with ironic amusement. Sterling shot him a look that blended impatience and faint amusement. War had a way of sharpening humor into something almost dangerous. It was a tool for keeping the mind from snapping under pressure. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka moved ahead of them, barefoot and silent, a small notebook clutched to his chest. He had spent weeks negotiating the uneasy language of fear with the civilians hidden inside. Every day he had walked into darkness to coax food, water, or simply a word of trust from the frightened souls who believed that any American soldier was a harbinger of death. His eyes reflected the toll of that weight, 32 years old and carrying the guilt of guiding strangers through peril, knowing that one wrong step could turn trust into tragedy. The soldiers had come to understand that the caves were not merely shelters. They were entire microcosms of human persistence. Stalactites hung like frozen daggers from the ceilings, and bats flitted in awkward, silent arcs, as if they were shadowed sentinels keeping watch over the frightened inhabitants. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, the faint scent of damp earth mingling with the sharper tang of fear and illness. Sterling knelt near the entrance, fingers tracing the edges of the rock as though seeking a hidden message left by the unseen tenants. He could almost hear the whispered prayers of mothers clutching children, the quiet defiance of the elderly who refused to surrender dignity to circumstance. "Captain," Malone whispered, nodding toward a faint movement near the entrance. Sterling froze, heart hitching. A child's cough echoed from deep within, hollow and fragile. It was the sound of life insisting stubbornly on existence, and it struck Sterling with more force than any artillery ever had. That single cough told him everything. The caves were alive with people, more numerous than any reconnaissance report had suggested, more desperate than he had imagined. Sterling exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried calm authority. "We proceed carefully. No surprises. No mistakes." He glanced at Tanaka, who inclined his head in silent agreement. They moved forward together, soldiers and interpreter stepping into the threshold where sunlight failed, where shadows pooled like ink and the jungle's noise faded into an oppressive hush. Even in this tense, somber moment, life persisted in small, oddly comic ways. A chicken, likely abandoned and half-starved, pecked nervously at Malone's helmet, clucking as though reprimanding the intruders for disturbing the peace. Malone's suppressed chuckle was a small rebellion against the suffocating dread. Sterling allowed himself a faint, wry smile. Sometimes courage began with noticing the absurdity hiding in plain sight. As they entered, Sterling's mind catalogued the stakes. 1,200 civilians, 7 miles of tunnels, 3 days of reconnaissance, and the ever-present threat that every step might trigger disaster. Some were sick, some were injured, all were terrified. And yet, the sheer persistence of life, the delicate intertwining of hope and survival, filled the space with a strange, trembling energy. Deep inside the cave, voices stirred, a soft, almost imperceptible choir of fear, whispered plans, and quiet prayers. Sterling paused, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer than seemed natural. In that moment, he understood that discovery was not simply about rescue. It was about meeting the resilience of humanity, about acknowledging the lives that had endured against impossible odds. And as the soldiers pressed further into shadow, the echo of another cough, slightly stronger this time, reminded him that they were not alone. The first step into the darkness had been taken. What came next would test courage, patience, and the fragile thread of trust that held both sides together. Sterling inhaled deeply, the smell of earth, sweat, and faint smoke filling his lungs, and thought, This was war in its rawest, most human form. And yet, somehow, hope clung stubbornly to the shadows. The cave's mouth closed behind them with a reluctant groan, swallowing Sterling, Malone, and Tanaka in darkness that felt nearly solid. Their flashlights pierced narrow cones of light, illuminating damp rock walls slick with condensation, and the occasional scrawl of what might have been a child's desperate drawing months ago. Every step echoed like a gunshot in the still air, each footfall a reminder of the delicate balance between discovery and disaster. Malone's boots slipped slightly on moss-slick stone, and he hissed under his breath, "If I die slipping on moss, I swear I'll haunt you personally, Captain." Sterling gave a faint smirk, resisting the urge to tease. Humor here was both shield and bridge. It was as much a part of survival as caution, a way to remind themselves that they were still human amidst the suffocating fear. Tanaka led the way with careful steps, barefoot and silent, his ears attuned to every whisper, every creak of rock, every tentative movement from deeper within. "There are more than we expected," he said quietly, almost to himself. His voice carried the weight of months spent negotiating between two worlds, the disciplined, foreign soldiers at the cave entrance, and the civilians who had learned to live as shadows of their own lives. Sterling gestured for the soldiers to spread slightly, scanning for hazards and hidden alcoves. The deeper they went, the more apparent it became that this was not merely a hiding place but a makeshift village. Makeshift bedding lined jagged ledges, stacks of rice bowls, wooden and chipped, were carefully stored in alcoves. Small fires had once flickered in niches, leaving faint black scars on stone. The civilians had not merely survived, they had adapted, carved out a fragile existence in utter darkness. A sudden rustle made Malone drop to one knee, weapon raised. Sterling's flashlight caught a chicken darting across a narrow ledge, its feathers catching the light in a brief, absurd flash of white. "Life," Malone muttered, shaking his head, "insists on being ridiculous." Sterling allowed himself a faint laugh. The tension in the cave was near suffocating, and yet the presence of such trivial absurdity reminded them that life persisted even here, stubborn and irreverent. Voices began to rise from the shadows. At first, they were barely audible, whispers, coughs, the soft shuffle of movement. Then Mrs. Yoko Sakamoto emerged, leaning on a makeshift cane, her hair streaked with gray and her eyes sharp with determination. "We are still here," she said softly, as if asserting her people's right to existence. Tanaka bowed slightly in respect, and Sterling felt a surge of something he hadn't expected. Awe, tempered with responsibility. These were not passive victims. They were the authors of survival. Children clung to their mothers or older siblings, eyes wide and unblinking, their small hands brushing against unfamiliar boots and sleeves. Sterling saw a boy of no more than 10, cheeks smudged with soot, gripping the edge of a ledge with a courage that made him pause. "Don't be afraid," he said, almost automatically, though he knew fear could not be commanded away. The boy's nod was subtle, but it carried the weight of trust, a fragile bridge between soldiers and those they had come to protect. The deeper they advanced, the more the cave revealed its labyrinthine complexity. Narrow tunnels branched off in impossible angles, sometimes leading to dead ends, sometimes opening into hidden chambers. Tanaka took careful notes, marking areas where civilians had constructed small living spaces, noting makeshift ventilation shafts and hidden stores of water. Sterling's mind raced with logistics, how to evacuate this many people without triggering panic, without leaving anyone behind. The number, 1,200, was not just a statistic. It was a measure of lives balanced precariously between hope and disaster. Then a faint melody, barely more than a breath, drifted from a deeper chamber. A woman's voice, singing in low, wavering tones, a lullaby carried through stone and shadow. Sterling froze, listening, and realized the song had survived months of fear and darkness. It was small, fragile, and miraculous, a testament to the human need to hold on to hope, even in the most desperate circumstances. Malone's whisper cut the moment, laced with awe. "They're still alive in every sense that matters." Tanaka pointed to a narrow passage veiled in shadow. "There is more," he said quietly. "Many more than we counted. They have found ways to hide deeper." Sterling felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders. Every step forward was a promise. No one would be left behind. And yet the cave had more secrets than they had anticipated, each corner a potential threat, each shadow a challenge to courage. As they moved further into the labyrinth, Sterling thought of the world outside, the war raging, the artillery, the heat, the endless demands of duty, and realized that inside these tunnels, time and fear had formed a different universe, one measured not in days or battles but in breaths, glances, and whispered trust. They were stepping into the heart of resilience itself, and the echoes of coughs, whispers, and that tentative lullaby reminded him that discovery was only the beginning. The deeper shadows held more surprises, and with each step, Sterling knew that the true test of courage was only just beginning. The first warning came as a distant rumble, low and trembling through the earth, vibrating up Sterling's boots and into his chest. Shellfire had begun again, skirting the cliffside above the cave entrance, and every echo threatened to collapse the fragile sanctuary within. Sweat ran in rivulets down Sterling's neck as he signaled the squad to move faster, each step a careful negotiation with uneven stone and unseen roots. Malone muttered, "I always wanted fireworks in a war, just not aimed at civilians," and Sterling allowed himself a tight-lipped smile, the brief humor a lifeline against mounting dread. Private Tommy Hayes stumbled over a slick patch of rock, the effort of carrying supplies and fear weighing heavily on him. Sterling caught him by the arm. "Steady," he said. "Fear is loud, but it's not a command. Follow my lead." Hayes nodded, cheeks flushed, eyes wide in the flickering flashlight glow. Sterling recognized himself in the young soldier. Raw, human, vulnerable, yet capable of extraordinary resilience when guided. Deeper in the cave, the civilians waited tensely. Mothers clutched children, elders leaned on walls for support, and the sick lay on rough bedding carved from tarps and moss. Tanaka whispered instructions to Sterling, translating the unspoken panic into manageable steps. "The first group is ready. We move in phases, carefully, slowly. Everyone has a role. Panic will spread faster than bullets." Sterling acknowledged with a curt nod. Here, strategy was inseparable from humanity. Success meant survival, failure meant lives lost. The first phase began. Sterling motioned for Malone and Hayes to guide small groups through narrow passages, their boots echoing against stone walls like solemn drums. Civilians, though hesitant, followed Tanaka's calm direction, faces pale but determined. Some of the older children carried small bundles of food, tiny acts of defiance against the darkness they had endured. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the metallic scent of fear, yet threaded through it was a fragile determination. A rock shift from above made everyone freeze. The distant rumble of artillery had loosened a small ledge, and a cascade of pebbles clattered down toward them. Hayes yelped, and Sterling's heart thumped, the sound almost deafening in the tense silence. "Move!" Sterling barked, and the group pressed on, the soldiers' experience and authority guiding the civilians through the peril. In these moments, courage was as much about voice and presence as it was about physical action. They reached a wider chamber, a temporary haven, and Sterling allowed a brief pause. Malone's eyes roamed the space, noting improvised bedding, hidden containers of water, and small charms left for protection. "Even in fear, they decorate life," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. Sterling allowed himself a flicker of admiration, the sight of human resilience carved into stone both humbling and invigorating. The second wave of evacuation began, and the stakes escalated. Tanaka moved among civilians, gently correcting a child's pace, encouraging the sick to keep moving, whispering reassurances that felt almost miraculous in their authority. Mrs. Sakamoto guided a frail elderly man by the arm, her voice firm yet soothing. Sterling watched, struck by the inversion of roles. The soldiers here were guardians, yes, but these civilians, hardened by months of fear and resourcefulness, were teachers in courage. Suddenly, a deeper chamber revealed more hidden inhabitants, many of whom had been overlooked in initial counts. Voices rose in startled relief, whispers merging into cries and laughter, the sound ricocheting against stone like fragile bells. Sterling's chest tightened. The scale of responsibility now swelled beyond what he had imagined. Each life recovered was a victory, but also a reminder of the narrow margin separating triumph from tragedy. As the last group moved toward the exit, a sudden rockslide blocked a side passage. Dust filled the air, eyes stung, hearts raced. Sterling leapt forward, rallying both soldiers and civilians. "Stay calm. Follow me." His voice was steel over trembling voices. Malone and Hayes cleared debris as Tanaka guided terrified civilians through alternate routes, their coordination a fragile choreography of life and danger. Finally, the last few civilians emerged into relative safety, mud-smeared and trembling, yet alive. Sterling inhaled, the sharp taste of dust and sweat on his tongue, and realized the full magnitude of what they had accomplished. The cave had been a crucible. Fear and fire tested every nerve, every decision, every ounce of courage. And yet, in the echoes of shuffling feet, coughing, and whispered reassurances, Sterling felt a profound truth settle in his chest. Bravery was rarely loud. It was measured in persistence, in the quiet refusal to abandon life when the world insisted on despair. Even as artillery continued its distant roar, the soldiers and civilians shared a fleeting, unspoken understanding. They had faced fire, fear, and the very unpredictability of survival, and emerged intact. Tanaka's eyes met Sterling's briefly, a silent acknowledgement. They were no longer strangers navigating shadows. Together, they had become guardians, guides, and witnesses to the enduring strength of humanity. The cave still held darkness, but the people within had found a fragile, flickering light, and the promise that courage, once tested, could ignite even the deepest shadows. The first rays of dawn touched the Mariana Cliffs with a soft, almost apologetic light, spilling gold over the scarred landscape. Sterling emerged from the final cave mouth, boots sinking into damp soil, heart hammering from hours of tension that had felt like days. The civilians poured after him, frail figures stiff from confinement, hair matted with sweat and soot, eyes blinking in astonishment at the sudden brilliance. Birds rose in startled flocks, their cries cutting through the early morning quiet, a chaotic chorus to mock survival. Sterling took a steadying breath, the metallic tang of sweat and earth still thick on his tongue. Around him, Malone shook his head, grinning despite the grime and exhaustion. "I'll never complain about jungle heat again," he muttered, voice husky, "not after that rockslide ballet." Sterling allowed himself a thin smile, though it was more acknowledgement than relief. Humor, like courage, had its place here. Brief, sharp, a salve for nerves frayed by fear. Tanaka moved among the civilians, hands gentle on shoulders, eyes reading silent signals of trust, relief, and disbelief. He guided children forward, whispered instructions to elders, reassured mothers clutching bundles of rice or tiny trembling hands. His calm authority had been their lifeline in the darkness, a bridge between worlds steeped in suspicion and fear. Sterling watched him and felt a quiet respect. Tanaka bore burdens invisible to the untrained eye, carrying both the civilian's hope and the soldier's responsibility in the same measured steps. Mrs. Yoko Sakamoto appeared near the edge of the clearing, supporting an elderly man, her hair still streaked with gray, her posture regal despite weeks of confinement. She looked over the assembled group, eyes scanning faces, noting injuries, exhaustion, and the smallest flickers of resilience. Sterling recognized a leader who had held a hidden kingdom together for months, who had commanded courage quietly, without weapons or authority, through the sheer weight of presence. The evacuation had been meticulous. Small groups escorted along natural paths, civilians trained by necessity to move without panic, soldiers coordinating each passage like conductors of an intricate, perilous symphony. Sterling counted heads one final time. 1,200 civilians, every single one accounted for. Relief rolled through him like a wave, a bittersweet triumph tempered by the awareness of how close disaster had always lurked in shadows. The cliffside rumbled faintly, a distant echo of war, reminding all that the world outside the cave had not paused. Sterling's eyes swept over the horizon, where smoke from distant shelling drifted lazily across the sky. In that moment, he realized what courage had meant here. It was not a grand, cinematic gesture, but a series of choices made under impossible conditions. Courage had been measured in every whispered reassurance, every careful step, every hand held steady in darkness. A child laughed, sharp and unrestrained, startling the birds into another chaotic flight. Sterling turned to see Tommy Hayes kneeling beside a boy, helping him untangle his soiled clothing, a small act that seemed monumental. Malone clapped Hayes on the shoulder, and Sterling allowed himself a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were not simply rescuers. They had become witnesses to the persistence of life in its rawest, most unguarded form. As the last group crossed the clearing, Sterling paused, squinting against the rising sun. The caves behind them, once wombs of shadow and fear, had been emptied without a single life lost. And yet the experience lingered in their minds, etched into memory like faint carvings on rock, the coughs that guided them, the lullabies that floated through stone, the faint scent of resilience clinging to every corner. Each civilian carried a piece of that darkness with them, and Sterling knew that survival was not merely physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and sometimes absurdly, even humorous. He watched as Mrs. Sakamoto guided the elderly man toward temporary shelters, noting the tentative relief in their movements. Tanaka lingered nearby, scanning for stragglers, his gaze meeting Sterling's. There was no need for words. Both men understood the enormity of what had just been achieved. The 1,200 souls emerging from darkness were not just numbers, they were symbols of endurance, reminders that human tenacity could endure horrors and still find a way into the light. Sterling stepped forward, dirt-streaked and exhausted, and allowed himself a moment to see the scene whole. Children clinging to mothers, soldiers watching quietly, birds rising against the pale sky, the faint smell of smoke and wet earth mixing with human sweat and hope. He realized the cave had been more than a hiding place. It had been a crucible. And emerging into daylight was not simply escape, it was rebirth. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. We were supposed to be hunters. Today we were guardians. The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of months of fear, hope, and unimaginable responsibility. Around him, civilians began to murmur, laugh softly, and move with tentative confidence. Sterling felt the fragile light of possibility stretch across the clearing, a symbol of what humanity could endure and overcome, even when the world threatened to swallow it whole. The dawn spilled across the hills like a promise, warm and unyielding, and Sterling knew that the story of courage, fear, and survival would follow them long after the caves had been left behind. 1,200 souls had walked out of darkness into sunlight, and in that moment, hope had been made tangible, flickering and unbroken. The war raged still, but for one brief, powerful dawn, life had triumphed in the shadow of fear.